Hey everyone, we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Kristen.
I'm Dr. Erin.
And welcome to our Crown adjacent coverage of what was happening in Northern Ireland while the royals were being royal. Da, 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 da.
Special edition, Northern Ireland.
Another country existed in the United Kingdom.
What?
So we are aware that 99% of the people watching The Crown don't care. Cool. We care deeply about this, and so therefore we're going to talk about it a little bit.
Yep.
In 1981, while everyone else was watching the spectacle that was the royal wedding, there were individuals in Northern Ireland on a protest at the Maze prison who deeply believed that they should be political prisoners and treated as political prisoners instead of the criminal way they were instead of the criminals they were being treated as. These gentlemen were all members of the Irish Republican Army
and INLA
and the INLA, which is another group. These men were all of the British should leave the island immediately persuasion.
Correct.
Maggie Thatcher, previous to 1981, has already made it clear to the British public that she, even though many of these are technically her citizens, she does not see them as such, and is not interested in negotiating or talking on any level, really, with this group of individuals. Now, that is certainly a little bit biased. Can't lie. We don't love Maggie Thatcher up in this YouTube channel, but prisons are not my area of expertise. Aren't we all so lucky that we in fact have an actual factual, got a PhD in it, expert on political prison protests in Northern Ireland during the Troubles? So Dr. Hinson, can you tell us what we should know about the 81 hunger strikes and anything else making you grumpy about its exclusion from the narrative of The Crown?
It would be my absolute pleasure. For those of you that maybe you just found this because your YouTube algorithm is set to things about Northern Ireland, which fair, because that's us too. Dr. Kristen and I both got our PhDs at the Queen's University Belfast of Northern Ireland. We lived there for 5 years. We've both been studying Northern Ireland for over 15 years each, throughout our academic and professional and personal lives. So we have a very deep investment in that part of the world, in that wee province. And we have a lot of knowledge about it as well, to toot our own horns and the bookshelves behind us currently. And we've said this in other videos of our Crown coverage, that we will always see the lens of what happened during this particular part of British history through the lens of Northern Ireland. That is not a lens we can turn off. We have turned it off slightly for our episode recaps. But when we feel it is warranted, we are doing these special edition check-ins with Northern Ireland, which was, part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That
right there in the title.
Right there in the title, that Margaret Thatcher was indeed the Prime Minister of. So the context of the 1981 hunger strikes, in the middle of this ongoing political conflict in Northern Ireland that roughly starts in the late 60s, escalates throughout the early 70s. And in 1972, a particular Secretary of State for Northern Ireland awarded special category status for people who were convicted of politically motivated crimes. That is a crime that has a political aim to it, as opposed to robbing a bank for your own personal gain. You know, the IRA might have robbed a bank to fund their effort to change the political circumstances in Northern Ireland. So they awarded this effectively political status. They just didn't want to call it political status. So that was 1972. Shifting British governments several times to the year of our Lord, 1976, and we have a very different Secretary of State. We have the incoming conservative reign that is coming to Great Britain. Not quite Maggie Thatcher yet, but we're close. And after the election, 1976, the Secretary of State decides that after the 1st of March, 1976, all newly arrested people for political crimes in Northern Ireland will be treated as a criminal. So there were several concessions that came with political status. You could freely associate with other people. You could wear your own clothing. You didn't have to wear a prison uniform or perform prison work, kind of prisoner of war camp restrictions or lack of restrictions. All of that taken away for new prisoners. And the men, all men in this particular prison who were incarcerated, immediately started protesting this change in status. So from 1976 to 1980, we get a series of escalating protests from almost entirely Republican prisoners, loyalist prisoners, which we mentioned in another video, started out in 1976, but for lots of reasons did not continue. Republican prisoners, mostly in the IRA, escalated their protest right through into Maggie Thatcher's premiership. And in 1980, we get the start of the first hunger strike to protest for gaining political status again. That hunger strike did not succeed. Whatever that means by succeeding, it didn't get.
It did not accomplish its goal.
It did not accomplish its goal. It was bungled, to be frank, and so it was scrapped, and they decided to start again. Yep. So the 1st of March, 1981, the IRA and some other affiliate groups, other Republican groups, decided to commence a hunger strike in which it was staggered. That means that a prisoner would go on hunger strike every 2 weeks. Because one of the problems with the 1980 hunger strike was that they all went on hunger strike at the same time. After several months, a couple of the protesters were very sick and they called off the strike. So to prolong the impact and hopefully achieve their goals, they decided this time to stagger them. So they started the 1st of March, 1981, and it lasted for 10 months. At the end of those 10 months, 10 men were dead. By the time of the royal wedding in 1981, in July of 1981, 6 of those 10 men had died on hunger strike. And it was a seminal moment in British politics, not just uniquely to Northern Ireland, but really solidified this break in a relationship, if there ever was a solid one, between Northern Ireland and the British government, particularly the personality of Maggie Thatcher. And she made a very famous speech to the Houses of Parliament, Stormont buildings in Northern Ireland in 1981, the 5th of March, 1981. So 4 days after the start of the second hunger strike, she made a visit. And this political speech is one of those like iconic British political speeches. And it was referenced in the Crown episode of when Lord Mountbatten was assassinated, which was in 1979, not 1981, where she's talking on the phone with Queen Elizabeth. And she says, there is no such thing as political murder, political bombing, or political violence. So that did not happen on the phone, as we said in our previous video. This happened in this speech, and the full quote is worth reading, and then I promise I'll be done explaining the hunger strikes. Once again, we have a hunger strike at the Maze prison in the quest for what they call political status. There is no such thing as political murder, political bombing, or political violence. There is only criminal murder, criminal bombing, and criminal violence. We will not compromise on this. There will be no political status. So that was her perspective at the start of the hunger strikes. That perspective certainly contributed to the death of those 10 men. The government backed off on that. There will be no political status by the end. It was a huge shift in political support for the Republican movement, which changed the face of Northern Ireland and Ireland for the rest of the 20th and into the 21st century. There is no small way to state the significance of the 1981 hunger strikes and the impact that it had on British and Irish politics. So for that reason, you can see me just a little bit miffed that it's nary a mention in The Crown of this season, and we have already into episode 5 jumped past it. But it's worth mentioning, even for its just political significance on a show that ostensibly talks about.
Yeah, the Falklands was not even close to as significant in terms of British politics.
The what was?
The Falklands weren't.
I mean, the legacy of the Falklands in England is still a really big thing that I don't completely understand. But like, in terms of like a global political scale, I would argue the hunger strikes were more significant. Certainly.
They are at least as significant, especially when you think that the Falklands War did not happen during Mark Thatcher's disappearance. So that kind of shoving together was already a narrative choice. It wasn't already historical fact. And we've talked frequently about that. We are frequently confused by the narrative choices that Peter Morgan makes in the story that he wants to tell.
Right, because I think we recognize it's historical fiction. 100%.
Oh my gosh, yes.
We value historical fiction. And I know a lot of times it can be confusing for our viewers that sometimes we critique the history and sometimes we don't. But it's the question of how he uses the history.
Yeah, and that's what always kind of interesting to us.
To just like make up a completely different narrative, that's totally his dramaturgical right. But it's the fact that he selectively uses bits of history only when it's helpful that makes it really difficult to differentiate between the fictitious characters and the real people, because there's such a muddling of that history.
Yeah, that's the thing. We are not alone in being constantly confused as to what story he is telling, by the way. Like, there's a lot of critics who are kind of like, talk to me about why we went with this scene. But it is never that they are unable to accomplish accuracy, as you can see by Diana's wardrobe this season. It is a constant choice, a narrative choice. I don't think I would put the hunger strikes in an episode about the royal wedding, can't lie. Absolutely. But I probably would have had Maggie Thatcher say something to somebody about them.
It would have been a fascinating thing to even include this speech, because you want to talk about one of the most quoted political speeches of the 1980s.
It was actually, I know I've read several places that it was one of the speeches that President Reagan talked about, really using as an inspiration for his war on crime in the United States. So it's very, not that Peter Morgan needs to give a toss about Ronald Reagan. I, in fact, hope he doesn't. But they were, when we look at geopolitical realities of the 1980s, the two of them were besties. And so that's a really significant speech, and that I just kind of wish we would have touched on a little. Because he is, I think, trying to make us think Maggie Thatcher was a good prime minister. And I believe he's trying to make us think that. I will not agree with him, but a lot of people will. And one of the ways to do that is that she was really tough on crime, and that she treated everybody who was arrested in Northern Ireland as a criminal, regardless of their motivations and what that kind of did and what it kind of looked like. So I mean, like 2 sentences would have been interesting, I guess. But at the same time, we say this every time we talk about Northern Ireland. We're going to say it again. We have lots of Northern Irish friends that are super glad it didn't show up. So everything's messy.
It's very complicated. Yeah. So we have to be very clear, as always, that we speak for ourselves.
Yep.
And our opinions about what should and shouldn't be said about Northern Ireland. And especially, we talked about this in our first video about Northern Ireland, but it's worth mentioning again. The video montage of news clips that we got with the assassination of Lord Mountbatten included footage from during the hunger strikes.
Yes.
Which is very confusing. But it shows you that, like, whoever was doing the research was like, oh, these are significant clips, we should include them. But when you mess with the historical timeline like that, and you strip away the potency of the hunger strikes for when they happened, and the rise of politicians out of that, which there certainly was a huge swing of political movement out of republicanism at that time. The rise of Gerry Adams has a lot to do with how Sinn Féin behaved during the second hunger strike, and how they were able to capitalize on that politically.
So it's just confusing as to the narrative they're telling as the summary. Too long, didn't read. We are confused.
We are confused and frustrated.
And we will probably remain so. And we will probably see you again for one of these beep, 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 Northern Ireland special editions. If you have any questions for us on anything we covered, of course, the comments are below. Like I said, this is actually factually Dr. Hinson's area of expertise. So we do a lot of my areas of expertise. So please barrage her with questions. And she'd love to talk to you about prisons. And we will see you next time.
Bye, everybody.